All right, I'd like to get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad to have such a nice turnout for our session today, Dreams of United Europe. I'm Daniel Ziblatt. I'm the acting director for this semester of the Center for European Studies, while Grzegorz Ekiert is on leave. So today's panel discussion will serve as a prelude to the opening of a new exhibit in the CES Gallery featuring 25 original posters, which were selected as finalists for the Intra-European Cooperation for a Better Standard of Living poster contest held in 1950. You'll hear a lot more about this at 6 p.m. It's a really exciting exhibit. We're really just absolutely thrilled to have the opportunity to show this here and for this to be part of our community. I just want to say, by kind of way of introduction, that I'm very proud of the fact that life at CES contains multitudes. And by that I mean this morning I was in a seminar with Paul Tucker talking about with undergraduates what happens to a monetary policy in Europe in general when interest rates go down to zero. What happens next? And today, that's in the morning, and in the afternoon we're having an exciting art exhibit. So lots of stuff happens here, and I'm very proud of that. Life is not dull here. So why have this event, though, today? It's true that today, April 4th, marks the 70th anniversary of the signing of the NATO treaty. So that's worth noting. But that's not the only motivation. There's more to it than that. I mean, why have an event on a dream of united Europe when everyone is so focused on the immediate trauma of Brexit, the immediate threat of populism, economic divisions within Europe, illiberal forces dismantling the rule of law in Eastern Europe, and so on. You might think that instead of the dreams of Europe, we should be having a session on the dashing of European dreams, that might more properly fit the tenor of our times. But I actually think that a focus single-mindedly on the current disasters of our current moment would actually be a mistake, and that actually by turning to the past and looking at the founding of NATO, founding of the Marshall Plan, we can see real, serious historical achievements. Over the last couple of weeks, I've been reading a book I recommend to you, Ben Stiles' book, 2018 book, The Marshall Plan, Dawn of the Cold War, a really excellent book that I recommend to all of you. So from that book, we see that Europeans, with the assist from Americans, rebuilt democracy, created modern welfare states, and sustained 70 years of peace. So we should recognize that historical achievement. This achievement, of course, has been followed today with Brexit. There's a temptation to kind of overlook the achievement. But I think it's really critical that Brexit cannot erase this historical achievement. The point, I think, really becomes clear that when we look back to this historical period, a couple of points, but one that I want to emphasize today is that for all the talk of a community of shared values, for all the talk of dreams of united Europe and the importance of idealistic motivations, hard-nosed politics also played a very important role. Realpolitik was at play in this historical moment. The context of the Cold War was decisive. Competition with the Soviet Union loomed large. Atomic weapons were a big part of the story. So like all historical events, ideals played a major role, but so too did interests and power. So interests and ideals were present at the creation, to paraphrase Dean Acheson. So the point is that perhaps the past was not as glorious and as rosy as it sometimes seems in retrospect with the benefit of 70 years. And I think it's important to remember that in our current moment, because if the past was not as glorious as we sometimes imagine, perhaps the present is not as bad as we sometimes think. History moves in zigs and zags, and to really fully appreciate the challenges and possibly the opportunities of the current moment, it's really critical to remember this. So I think it's really important to use anniversaries, not just to celebrate, birthdays. My daughter has a birthday coming up. We're just going to celebrate that. But historical moments, historical events, it's important to use these kinds of opportunities to reflect on the current moment and to rethink the current moment in productive ways. And so that's exactly what we're going to do today. And I can't think of a better group of scholars and thinkers to have gathered for that purpose. So so I'll introduce each of the speakers very briefly in order of presentation. Mary Sarati is associate at CES and a longtime friend of CES, is the inaugural holder of the Kravis Chair in Historical Studies at Johns Hopkins, SAIS in Washington, D.C., and she'll be discussing the history of NATO and the legacy of the Marshall Plan. She's writing a book on NATO that everyone is looking forward to seeing. Christiane Lemke is a visiting scholar at CES, also a longtime friend of CES, and a professor of international relations and European studies at Leibniz University in Hanover. Her research interests include the creation of norms and customs and global governance. Today, she'll be sharing her thoughts on the European integration process and the evolution of the EU from the Cold War to the post-Cold War environment. And then finally, Paul Tucker, who was meeting with some undergraduates today as we were talking about interest rates this morning. Paul Tucker is a senior fellow at CES, a former deputy governor of the Bank of England. He will be addressing Europe's system, or kind of an idea of concentric circles in Europe and their importance given the current geopolitical environment and also the current dynamics of Brexit and how the UK could potentially fit into that. So again, thrilled that all of you are here, thrilled that the three of you are here. The way we'll proceed is each speaker will speak for about 10 to 12 to possibly 15 minutes, but that's the top. And then we'll open it up for discussion. And then afterwards, we'll be going over to the gallery for a celebration of the opening of the new gallery. So thank you, and we'll start with Mary.
Great, thanks so much. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. Since this is the Center for European Studies, allow me to start with Thucydides. Thucydides has Pericles' remark in his funeral oration, speaking of the Athenians, "In doing good, we are unlike others. We, the Athenians, make our friends by conferring, not by receiving favors." Sometimes I think on these anniversaries, you could substitute the U.S. there for the Athenians, as Dan has rightly pointed out. Sometimes on anniversaries, it's easy to praise the past, have rose-tinted glasses about it, see the Marshall Plan as this altruistic gesture, NATO similarly. But in fact, when you look at it as a historian, which is what I do as a historian of the Cold War, the story looks very different. Our topic today is the dream of a united Europe, but it's important to remember that the Marshall Plan and NATO were both born of a nightmare. That nightmare, of course, was the Second World War and the immense devastation that followed it. Just one statistic to show how long-lasting that devastation was. In February 1947, 19,000 Berliners had to be treated for frostbite. 2 years after the end of the war, the city was still unable to provide adequate housing, adequate heat. This was devastation on a scale that only the very oldest among us can remember. It's almost unimaginable. And this devastation in Europe, of course, was overshadowed by the rising Cold War conflict. So before we get too enthusiastic about using rose-tinted glasses to view the Marshall Plan and NATO, I just want to start by making clear we need to understand the difficulties that existed in Europe when the Marshall Plan and NATO were born. The Marshall Plan fundamentally, it was generous, but it was also a geopolitical initiative to prevent Moscow from dominating Europe, when you get right down to it. And the plan was executed brilliantly. There was a poll of historians of U.S. foreign relations a few years back, and all of them chose the Marshall Plan and its implementation as basically the policy highlight of the Cold War. The fact that the United States offered it not only to Western Europe, but to Central Europe as well, thus casting the Soviet Union in the role of the bad guy when the Soviet Union had to decline Marshall Plan aid, was a masterful means of implementation. So let me talk just a little bit, very briefly, about the history of the Marshall Plan, and then I want to talk a little bit about NATO, because as Ben Steele argues in the book that's already been rightly praised, they are really two sides of the same coin. The Marshall Plan, the goal of the Marshall Plan originally was to make Europe self-sufficient, to help give those Berliners who had frostbite roofs over their heads, jobs, even a stable currency. Of course, for long periods after World War II, the only reliable currency was the cigarette. That was the degree to which states had completely collapsed. The irony is that the Marshall Plan, in its goals of making Europe self-sufficient, failed because, in part, many Europeans said this is not enough. Economic aid is wonderful, but we need security guarantees as well. We, the Europeans, have now experienced 2 world wars where it took you Americans quite a long time to join us in those conflicts. The next conflict that may come with the Soviet Union may be a very quick conflict. Now we are in the nuclear era. We want a security commitment so you are with us in Europe from day one. And European leaders, the British in particular, pushed very, very hard to expand the commitment that it saw the U.S. making in economic terms into a security commitment. And of course, that then evolves into NATO. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me talk a little bit about the Marshall Plan. Initially, at the end of the Second World War, Roosevelt while he was still alive, was behind the initiative, the Bretton Woods Initiative, that tried to look for more global solutions to the conundrums of the post-war world. One of the great open questions in history is what Roosevelt really would have done if he had lived. He was famously inscrutable. He famously agreed with everyone, so everyone would leave his office thinking, I know what Roosevelt was going to do. I'm absolutely certain I know what Roosevelt was going to do. But Roosevelt kept his actual cards very close to his chest, and you only really knew what he was going to do when he did it. And of course, he did not live to implement a post-war order. So we don't really know what Roosevelt would have done, but it seemed as if he was, at least based on events up to his death, trying a more internationalist approach. Truman, of course, became president. When Truman became president unexpectedly after Roosevelt's death, he was woefully ignorant of what Roosevelt was planning. As best as historians can tell, he may only have spoken to Roosevelt in person twice after he was elected vice president. Roosevelt did not like him, felt that he was forced on him on the presidential ticket, certainly did not take him into his confidence. And so Truman became president woefully unprepared to deal with the very, very full inbox left behind by Roosevelt's death. So Truman made a series of fateful decisions, and he effectively mothballed the newly born IMF, dismissing disdainfully the notion that Soviet cooperation would continue into the post-war period. Again, just to emphasize a caveat, I'm not sure Roosevelt was assuming Soviet cooperation would continue either, but he was at least making a good show of thinking that it would in the interest of getting the IMF off the ground. So instead, Truman, of course, in his Truman Doctrine, in the steps that he took in his nuclear programs, very much focused on a Western alliance rather than an international alliance. This, of course, was informed, as everyone knows, by the famous long telegram of February 1946, where George Kennan argued that there could be no modus vivendi with the Soviet Union, that the United States was kidding itself if it thought there could be any lasting cooperation. Efforts to cooperate in the occupation of Germany were collapsing spectacularly. The Western allies had to pull away and construct their own political zones in an effort to restore order, to get a currency circulating that wasn't based on tobacco. And eventually it just became apparent that the Soviet Union wanted no part of those efforts. So by the time Marshall spoke not far from here in June 1947 to announce the Marshall Plan, there was no longer any pretense that the borders created by war were temporary. Initially, after World War II, the borders, particularly those in Germany, were just meant to be temporary, just temporary divisions to allocate responsibility to deal with the housing crisis and various other crises. But by 1947, it was apparent that those were not temporary. And Truman, and with his advisors, decided that the West would launch this major economic plan, the Marshall Plan. And of course, it was announced here and implemented between 1948 and 1952. Between just a few bullet point headlines, I don't want to go on at great length, between 1948 and 1952, the United States transferred $13.2 billion to Marshall Plan countries. Roughly speaking, in today's dollars, that would be $130 billion. The largest recipients were the UK, France, Italy, and West Germany. The biggest beneficiaries per capita were Austria and Norway, so you can see the reach of this program. Central and East European countries were interested as well, but of course were denied the ability to join the countries receiving Marshall Plan aid. There is a fervent debate among economic historians over the extent to which the Marshall Plan helped Europe to recover. There are historians around the Alan Milroth School who argue that no, Europe was actually poised for recovery on its own, so the Marshall Plan did not actually add that much value. Ben Steele, I think, correctly challenges that, saying it's hard to know for certain, but as Steele argues, the Marshall Plan aid certainly didn't hurt. As Steele said, quote, Milward's case is ultimately uncompelling, relying as it does on the far-fetched idea that less food would have achieved better results. So I think that Ben Steele is right about the Marshall Plan. Ben Steele asked, did the Marshall Plan work? And if the goal was to disengage militarily from Europe, then the answer is no, because as I've already indicated, various European leaders said Marshall Plan aid is not enough. We want there to be a security commitment as well. So in that sense, no, the Marshall Plan did not succeed. But it did succeed as a broader component of the containment strategy that Kennan enunciated. The idea behind the Kennan version of containment, and there was more than one version of containment, as John Lewis Gaddis's book Strategies of Containment has shown us. The Kennan version was recommended that the West be in a firm, patient, waiting position, maintaining its economic health, pushing back wherever the Soviet Union might try to impose its power onto the West, but not acting in an aggressive way. In other words, containing the Soviets to where they were. And Marshall Plan aid increased the ability of West European allies to carry out their role in that containment exercise. So a mixed result there, but Steele argues, I think correctly, that the Marshall Plan aid did significantly help the economic recovery of Europe. So NATO then arises as, of course, today is the 70th anniversary, as the security commitment that the Europeans want. They're greatly helped by further blunders on the part of Stalin. He, of course, blockades Berlin, which greatly increases anxieties in Western Europe that there might be further intrusions into political and economic life in Western Europe, thus increasing the interest and willingness of the United States to engage in security commitments. And then, of course, in 1949, the Soviet Union, sooner than anyone expected, detonates its own atomic bomb, thus causing panic in the West. The West had thought it would take the Soviet Union much longer to develop its own nuclear bomb. At that time, it was not known how effectively Soviet agents had penetrated the Western nuclear program and just how much they had accelerated the Soviet nuclear program. And so for a whole host of factors, NATO then evolves as the other side of the coin to the Marshall Plan, the security commitment. So what then gradually happens over time is there gets to be a blurring of the missions of these two organizations. And I'm only supposed to speak for a few minutes here. We're hoping to actually get a conversation going. So I'll skip over many decades here, but I'm happy to talk about this in the question and answer session. By the time you get to the 1990s, you see this curious blurring of the missions of NATO with what were originally the goals of the Marshall Plan. So once again, speaking in Harvard Yard, not far from here, in 1997, Madeleine Albright gets up to speak, and she's praising not the Marshall Plan, but of course, which by that point is a historic relic. She's speaking on the 50th anniversary of Marshall's speech. She praises NATO and says NATO integrates new democracies, eliminates old hatreds, provides confidence in economic recovery, and deters conflict. But these are actually the goals of the Marshall Plan, not NATO. So we're starting to freight NATO with these goals, which are actually far beyond its mission. And NATO is actually a very awkward vehicle to achieve these goals. And in fact, NATO's track record of consolidating democracy is actually very mixed. NATO took countries on board, Portugal, Turkey, with dubious democratic credentials. Staying outside NATO didn't seem to harm the democracy or Western ideas of Sweden or Finland. Meanwhile, being in NATO has not prevented the disintegration in Poland and in Hungary of democratic ideals. So it's clear that if NATO's goal is to secure democratization, then it is failing in that regard. There's also a broader issue with NATO. NATO is fundamentally a Cold War organization. When it comes right down to it, it was intended to basically defend Western Europe from Soviet tanks and later Soviet nuclear weapons. And now we find ourselves in the post-Cold War era, and we are, of course, celebrating NATO's anniversary, but it is still fundamentally that Cold War organization. And it has two embedded default settings that are still with us. NATO is set up for a divided Europe. And the post-Cold War moment did not end that division. There is still a front line in Europe. It's just moved farther to the east, right? It's now closer to Moscow than it was before. So Europe is still divided, and NATO is now basically snapping back to that default setting. It's ready to fight war in a divided Europe. It never truly became a pan-European security organization, despite various initiatives in the 90s to reach out to Russia. Those, I would argue, were more window dressing than serious efforts. And now unfortunately, under Putin's grim, murderous regime, all hope of truly creating some kind of European security structure, whether based on the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, as was discussed in 1989, or on some other organization, those are all well and truly gone. That window of opportunity has firmly shut. So we have NATO, which has, as I said, two embedded default settings. One is European division, and that is now being reinforced once again. The other embedded default setting is U.S. leadership. U.S. leadership is crucial to NATO. And as Nick Burns and Doug Lute have pointed out recently, we now have a president who, some nice rhetoric during Jens Stoltenberg's visit aside, essentially doesn't believe in NATO and sees NATO as a burden. And so you have this organization that relies on an assumption of U.S. leadership, but that leadership, the leader now is voluntarily basically taking his hat and disappearing. Bill Burns has this wonderful book out, The Back Channel, that I recommend to everyone. He describes Trump, this is his new book, he describes Trump as entering office with a powerful conviction untethered to history that the United States is being held hostage by the very order that it created at the end of the Cold War. The United States is Gulliver, and it's past time to break the bonds of the Lilliputians. Alliances are millstones. Multilateral arrangements are constraints rather than sources of leverage, and the UN and international bodies are distractions, if not altogether irrelevant. In just 2 years, the Trump administration has diminished the United States' influence, hollowed out the power of its ideas, and deepened divisions among its people about the country's global role. So we have this organization which was created in a nightmare situation. I would argue contributed, however, to creating strong transatlantic relations during the Cold War and in the early post-Cold War period, that now finds itself facing its greatest challenges as we enter this era of a new nightmare, where the United States seems to be taking its leave from the transatlantic partnership. So I'm glad that we are all here today to talk about this difficult dream of the united Europe and the reality of the nightmares that are facing us in the days ahead. Thank you very much.
How do we, Peter? Would you like me to press enter? Nope. Nope. Yes. Okay. Well, this was actually a wonderful kind of presentation showing how diverse actually the history of United Europe is. My first kind of point here is that the meaning of United Europe is not very clear. I mean, what do we mean by Europe? The European Union? But not all countries are members of the European Union, so Europe is much broader. Do we include Russia? Do we not include Russia? And United Europe is even more diverse in its meaning. Different people have different ideas about what United Europe actually is. When you study European integration, you look at the scholarship, you find different theories like neo-functionalism talking about an ever closer union. You find intergovernmentalism talking about intergovernmental negotiations, meeting somewhere at the lowest common denominator. We have the social constructivists who argue European unity is all about ideas, about ideals. But it's never quite clear how exactly a united Europe would look like. It changes over time. And I will start with a slide that leads you way back into the 1940s, right into the nightmare that was the basis for United Europe, namely the Second World War, and more precisely, the prisons and concentration camps in Europe. So here are two quotes. The first one is from the small island of Ventoteno. Altiero Spinelli and Ernesto Rossi and others were thinking in 1941 about what Europe could look like after the end of the Second World War. They were communists, they were fighting fascist Mussolini, and so they drafted this manifesto, which became actually the first founding document for later efforts to form a federal Europe. Actually, Spinelli was a member of the European Parliament later on. He was very instrumental in arguing for a constitution for Europe. So this idea of having a movement for a free and united Europe is right there in the prison of Ventoteno. The KZ Buchenwald, the concentration camp close to Weimar, was a concentration camp mostly with international inmates. Many Russians were killed systematically. Communists, socialists, Christians, people from all walks of life were interned in Buchenwald to work in the arms industry. And at the end of the Second World War, shortly before the Americans freed the concentration camp of Buchenwald, the inmates got together and drafted the Buchenwald Manifest. And it's one of the lesser known documents, which is why I find it important to kind of go back and say, well, even before the founding of the European community, the European Union, we had people who thought about a post-national order, an order in which nationalism would not play the major role because they saw the opposition to fascism and National Socialism saw that as a deadly force. Nationalism was a deadly force. So the idea to create another Europe was already born in these times of turmoil, Second World War. You all know probably Winston Churchill's famous speech in Zurich after the Second World War, where he talks about we need a kind of United States of Europe. That is a term that you find a lot in the literature later on, and it's interesting that a British politician actually talked about, this United States of Europe in the early time. But what actually happened in 1957 with the Treaty of Rome was not this grand new design for a political order of Europe, kind of a federal state, but a very practical economic community. The Treaty of Rome laid out the idea of the common market. And when you look at, and Mary mentioned some of the figures, the rebuilding of Europe after the Second World War, it makes a lot of sense to talk about the economy, improving the living conditions of people. But one thing I wanted to point out here in the document is that it actually says in the preamble that the founding states, 6 founding members, calling upon the other peoples of Europe who share their ideal to join, the ideal to have freedom, to have peace in Europe. This becomes very important in a period, in the post-Cold War period. That's why I wanted to point it out. The European Economic Community is not only about economic aspects, trade, free trade, modernization, but it's also about the idea of peace and of freedom. And as it was pointed out already, during the Cold War, the reality of the European dream was that Europe was deeply divided, that the dream of united Europe became only true for the West Europeans and not for all of Europe. Here 2 slides from Berlin, my hometown. The first picture is 1961 when the wall was built, 1989, shortly before it came down, downtown Berlin. A very deadly wall, right? Which is why Angela Merkel so strongly opposes concepts of the wall uttered by Donald Trump. The 1989 period is very important because all of a sudden Europe opens up, right? The wall falls. Now the wall is a gallery, the East Side Gallery in Kreuzberg. If you go to Berlin today, you hardly see where the wall once stood. And this division, East and West, is a very, very significant turning point for European integration. For one thing I wanted to point out here is the return to Europe. Václav Havel, in 1990, the first president of the Free Republic of Czechoslovakia, and many others who came out of the opposition in East Central Europe, in Poland, in Hungary, and other countries in the Baltics, saw the opening of East Central Europe, the end of communist rule, as a return to Europe. And that's a very interesting phrase because it means a couple of things. It means clearly, and that is what Havel talked about a lot in his speeches, that in fact the East Central European countries had been part of Europe all the time. In the 19th century, in the 18th century, Poland was one of the countries in Europe which had the first constitution. It didn't really work, but it was, you know, the idea of kind of division of power, regulating power divisions, kind of a democratic concept, which then became very prominent with the French Revolution and other revolutions in Europe, but also in the United States. We are returning to Europe the Enlightenment idea of freedom, of reason, of the free will of the people. That was one major feature, one idea, one dream, I should say, that Havel was drawing on. The other was, of course, security, that Václav Havel was one of the first proponents of NATO membership, which is kind of surprising if you think about the communist era when all of these countries were so tightly knit into the Warsaw Treaty organizations. But here you have visionaries who early on said, we need to not only free ourselves from Soviet rule, but moreover become members of NATO, of all institutions, you know. So that was a real kind of turning point in the history. Now, yeah, looking at today, so I'm kind of leaping forward into the year 2004, actually. The question we are discussing right now in European integration theory, do we need a theory of disintegration, right? There are multiple crises in Europe. And the first crisis, the ratification of the Constitutional Treaty, which failed, was a several year-long process to draft a constitution for Europe, to more clearly express the basis for the fundaments of a polity. That dream died in the fancy negotiation rooms and in referenda. And the Lisbon Treaty of 2009 was somehow a compromise, but it is another, you know, intergovernmental treaty. So no constitution for Europe. The next crisis, of course, is the Eurozone crisis. And this crisis really showed a crisis in solidarity in Europe, that we had, you know, a deep division between the Northern European, Central European countries on one hand, Southern European countries on the other. And helping Greece or Portugal, Spain was kind of a very complex and complicated process. So the European crisis really deepened the division between North and South, and it's not quite over yet. The refugee crisis, the dream of human rights, freedom, liberty, a decent standard of living, is drowning in the Mediterranean Ocean, where Mediterranean Sea, where thousands of refugees died and did not make it across. Many thousands did come across into Europe, but the EU does not have a coherent refugee policy. Frontex is not really working properly. And just recent decisions to not help people who are in danger of drowning and dying. I mean, it's a shame for the European Union. The fourth big crisis, of course, is Brexit. And I would say it's not only kind of a very complex, drawn out, unhappy process, it also signals a crisis of British democracy, that you cannot come up with a resolution, with a decision. But it's also a crisis for us in Central and Continental Europe, a crisis of European identity. What kind of Europe do we need? So I would argue that 2019 is a critical juncture in European development, in particular because we have an upcoming election for the European Parliament in May 2019. So not only the Brexit decision, which we don't know how it's going to come out, but the elections in May will tell us more about the different conceptions, the different ideas. Citizens in Europe, 500 million citizens in Europe, all in all. Not all of them are eligible to vote, but it is quite a large and diverse group of countries and people. So what are the preferences? And looking at this critical juncture, and these are my kind of concluding remarks here, I think a theory of disintegration might be a bit too simple. Rather, I would see European integration between, on one end of the scale, full integration, on the other end of the scale, full disintegration. Both is theoretically possible, full integration or complete disintegration, because following Brexit, other countries might actually get an appetite to leave. We have other divisions in Europe that pertain to the rule of law in member countries of the EU. So, there's a lot of conflict, actually. So I kind of will chart out two possible scenarios. One is what I call the populist implosion, meaning that the pressure of right-wing and left-wing populism on Europe and in different all European countries, one can say, is so enormous that the whole idea of an integrated Europe, a post-national political community, will actually come to an end. The rise of populism, populist parties, political leaders, is a shared feature, a shared problem in all European countries. The strength of the parties varies from country to country, but we are assuming that in the upcoming elections, this group might be quite strong. The other problem that we are facing, and we already heard a little bit about this, the backlash, illiberal practices in several European states, including Romania, including Hungary, and unfortunately also our neighbor country in Germany, Poland. So are we going back to a Europe of as a continent of strong nationalism, of strong nation states, which would maybe agree on some trade relations, better trade relations, but the dream of the united Europe that has been around, I would say since the 1940s, would be buried in the year 2019 to 2020. The other end of the scale, and I call that the Republican revival. Of course, there's always hope, and as a political scientist, I don't want to end here with a very gloomy kind of outlook. I'd like to jot in some, more positive lines of thought. The Republican revival, and this would include a redefining of what is Europe, what should Europe be, what kind of Europe do we want. So a truly European discourse about the future polity of the EU. Revival comes and will come from civil society groups. And I listed several. My students are researching, several of these groups: European Movement, Pulse of Europe, Volt Europe, and so on and so on. These are groups coming from the ranks of different societies in European member states. And that could be a very kind of, it could be a sign of renewal. And what I find very important is also to think about a different Europe where we kind of restructure the way we make decisions. And one of the grievances coming very clearly from many countries is the over-regulation of the EU. So why don't we think about reducing some of the regulations? We do not have to regulate everything in Europe. Some things are better organized closer to communities on the communal level, on the state level, in Euro regions, which are regions in Europe crossing borders. So that, from my perspective, would be a very valuable avenue to think about. And one last remark. The surveys show that especially the younger generation, is used to and appreciates open societies with open borders, the freedom of movement, supports the idea of liberal values. And this, I think the generational change could be a way in which Europe could renew itself. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dan and Elaine, for inviting me to participate in this. It's great for me and to be alongside Christiane and Mary. Oh, down there. Can you hear me now? I can easily speak louder otherwise, but that's okay? Okay. So I'm going to begin with a sentence or two about Brexit and end with a sentence or two about Brexit. And for those of you that may have noticed that when I arrived, I was looking at my iPad and probably thinking that's a bit rude. It was just that I was checking whether anything's happened in my country in the 3 to 4 hours in which I've been in a meeting somewhere else. And actually, the answer is a bit yes. So to begin with Brexit, so the Brexit referendum was in the summer of 2016, and in early autumn of 2016, I, alongside 4 other authors, drawn from across Western Europe, issued a paper on what we thought EU Brexit relations ought to look like and could feasibly look like in due course. And behind that lay a view of a Europe of concentric circles, which is where I will conclude this evening. It's worth mentioning who those other authors were and are, because we've intervened once since then, and I wouldn't rule out that we do so again. One of them is Norbert Röttgen, who chairs the Bundestag Foreign Affairs Committee. One of them is Jean Pisani-Ferry, who used to be the boss of the think tank embedded in the French government, and then, as many of you will probably know, headed the policy team of Emmanuel Macron in the run-up to the French presidential election. The other two were Guntram Wolff, who is the chief executive of Bruegel, which is in the top 3 or 4 economic think tanks in the world, and André Sapir, who is an economist specialist in trade. And we started, and I still fervently believe this, as I think the others do, in that the only sensible way of thinking about relations between Britain and Europe post-Brexit, or indeed about Europe at all, is to take account of the shifting geopolitical sands in the world. The various problems that Christiane has described are occurring at a moment when there is kind of a geological level shift in power in the world. China most obviously, but India within a few years, and prospectively within 10 or 15 years, possibly Brazil and possibly Indonesia. This will be a world of very large economic blocks where the key thing is not per capita GDP, it is having moderate per capita GDP and growing reasonably and having lots and lots of people. These groups will be immensely powerful, and there are some parts of international public policy which are to a very large extent determined by relative size. Trade negotiations are like that. Other areas are not. And we argued that the UK, partly because it could leave the EU but could not geographically leave Europe, and partly because of shared interests of security and shared interests in a certain type of international order, was bound to remain intermingled in some sense. I'm deliberately being loose at this point of the discussion with continental Europe and its institutions. And one way of thinking about this, as I start to broaden out, is that part of the People's Republic's strategy towards Europe is to avoid, so far as it can, ever entering into bilateral discussions or arrangements with the EU, but to enter into discussions and relationships with European nations, not even thinking of them as European member states. And I've been present when, much to my regret in a way, I heard Prime Minister Orban discuss this with Chinese people present, and of course most recently Italy entered into the Belt and Road Initiative. And one way of thinking about the Belt and Road Initiative is that if you were in Beijing, and even reluctantly, if you thought that over the next 20 or 30 years there was likely to be a moment when you felt a need to assert an East Asian version of the Monroe Doctrine, you would, if you thought that that was a serious possibility for you, you would want as many alliances and dependencies in the backyard of the United States and amongst its closest allies. So you would expect to see Beijing pursue a strategy of close economic relationships and other relationships in Latin America and in Europe and Africa, and lo and behold, that's exactly what we see. That's a rational thing for them to do. And so the current administration, and I would say actually the previous administration, who the current administration has supported Brexit, but the previous administration was as keen on bilateral relationships at times as it was on relationships with the EU. This is a Washington strategy that is, I mean, it must have people in Beijing and maybe, for all I know, Delhi, gamboling down the corridors. You have to work backwards from the other person's strategy and interests, even when you aim to be a friend in the long run. So that's the first set of remarks I want to make. The second is, if you think about the nature of the problems across EU, they vary enormously. So Poland, Hungary, and now it seems Romania as well, have distanced themselves from some of the core values of the rule of law and the core European institutions led on this by Vice President Timmermans have been struggling to find a strategy that will deal with that, and so the great blocks of European parties, with Orban's party recently being semi-excluded, suspended from the EPP. So that's one. Another one is, if you ask yourselves, and some of you may disagree with this, if you ask yourselves whether you think it likely that Poland or Hungary will satisfy their treaty obligation to join the monetary union within your lifetime, I think even the youngest person in the room, and sadly there aren't enough young people in the room, but even the youngest person in the room would probably put a pretty low probability on that. And yet it is a treaty obligation. And the serious point here for me is what it is to be the EU, where members have treaty obligations which it's extremely unlikely that they will fulfill. In parts of the south, Italy, Greece, to some extent Austria, to some extent Bavaria, in your country, Christiane, have faced issues with migration that aren't felt to the same extent in the island of Ireland, or in the island of Great Britain, or in my wife's country, Belgium, or in the Netherlands. Then if you think about the countries that are members of the monetary union, I'm trying to skip over different problems, because the monetary union takes away the ability to have a nominal exchange rate depreciation, but didn't underpin it, as any nation state has, with some kind of fiscal mechanism for absorbing what economists call asymmetric shocks, which is just something really bad happens on that side of the room, but not on this side of the room. That inevitably exacerbates strains, and those are even greater when some countries find it hard, because of the structure of their economy, to generate the rates of productivity growth that Germany is both very good at and is actually intrinsic in some respects to the structure of the German economy. And then you get to the kind of Britain's problem of, here's another problem in Europe, in that whether or not it's a crisis of democracy in my country, I kind of rather doubt, for what it's worth, and I think the word crisis should be used very loosely. It could become one, but I don't think it's one yet. But what it certainly is signaling that there is a rather large country in the EU where 3 years ago more than 50% of those choosing to vote were disenchanted with Europe. And in part, that is because of the opacity of decision-making. Something for you to, had my country voted to remain, I was going to have an op-ed in one of the big UK broadsheets arguing, now is the moment for us, the UK, to push for reform in some of the EU institutions, including greater transparency in the Council of Ministers when it is legislative in legislative mode? Why is it that you can watch what the Senate's doing when it is legislating, but you can't really watch what the Council of Ministers do? And this isn't just an airy-fairy point. This means that it is easier for politicians from Paris or my capital, London, to go to Brussels and say one thing and then return home and say another. So that actually matters a lot. And the feeling that in parts of Britain, parts of the British population, and it's not only amongst British citizens, that the EU is a kind of technocracy, certainly problems of a liberal democracy, but there is also a problem of undemocratic liberalism as well. I would say that because I've written a book about that in another context. So then, the third block of remarks I want to make is about the nature of the relationships which countries outside the EU, outside of the treaties of the EU, have with the EU. So, cutting through all of the detail, Norway is a member of the customs union and a member of the single market without actually having votes on the single market. Switzerland is a member of the customs union, but not a member of the single market, but has a series of bespoke deals. Turkey has a certain kind of customs type relationship with the EU. The Ukraine has an association agreement with the EU, and this meant that the UK, of course, I don't say it's more important, but it is bigger than any of those countries, and is a member of the Security Council, and alongside France is the only European country that has any capability to project force externally. And so basically my country is having a debate about, well, what bespoke agreement do we want? And I think that if the UK didn't exist, so the history of the world would be slightly different in some good ways and some bad ways. But if the UK didn't exist, I think you can still make a pretty good case that this bespoke, now what agreement shall we make with so-and-so? The Ukraine is a good example. Turkey is a good example. How could we make that a bit more structured? And this absolutely goes to where Mary began. So it seems to me the series of potential concentric circles, starting on the outside, is you would start with the idea, and the union isn't going to be quite the right word, but I'm going to use the word union rather than tie myself up in knots. The outer ring would be a security union, because what everybody in my end of Eurasia has in common is we are at the western end of Eurasia, and we have certain shared security needs that we don't share, say, with people in East Asia or people in South Africa. The second circle would be a customs union, and the idea behind this is that in a world of really big blocks, you are not going to get great trade agreements with anybody unless you are part of a bloc for customs purposes. So you could choose to be outside of the customs union and in the security union, because security matters even more than economic welfare, as the realists, in quotes, like to remind us. But if it matters to you getting getting better custom trade agreements, you might want to be part of the customs union. Anyone that hasn't, there's a book, I think she's called Alison Carnegie at Columbia, who wrote a book called Coercive Diplomacy on trade agreements. I mean, this is, I was an international monetary and financial person. My world was a world for grown-ups only. That world, wow, this is for grown-ups with weapons. The next ring inside would be, and I think it's useful to move away from the language single market. Single market isn't a coherent economic concept. It's a clear concept in law. Would be a regulatory union, and actually there could be two layers of this. You could have regulatory union for what this country would call interstate commerce in goods, but not necessarily a full regulatory union in services, as indeed is the case with the single market. And you might choose to be in one, but not the other. And the argument there is not airy-fairy, is if you're a member of the customs union but not part of the goods regulatory union, there will have to be checks at the borders as goods travel across physical borders. Services don't travel across physical borders in that way. They travel through the services space, which is not physical in quite the same way. And then at the center, where we have the monetary union, is there would have to be some deepening. There would have to be some type of fiscal union with it. Could be, and it would have to be incentive compatible and as well as values compatible, and it would have to be some political union. Now, imagine you have something like that. I would suggest, and this is just kind of personal views, is some members of the EU who have treaty commitments to join the monetary union wouldn't want to be part of the monetary union at all, might not actually want to be part of the regulatory union for services, might be in some kind of customs union, goods regulatory union space. The UK, for what it's worth, would have a clearer sense of, well, what are the options? It's plainly going to remain part of a security union, whether there's treaty agreements or not. The issue, for what it's worth, I think this is where Europe will end up, irrespective of whether it's where I think it should end up. I think it's where it will end up. I have no idea whether that will be in 10 years' time or in 50 years' time. But what I am confident of is that the current architecture isn't actually sustainable, because there are people with treaty obligations which they have no intention of meeting, and probably where the political culture will make it hard for them to fulfill their treaty obligations, as I say, in decades ahead. And there are others who think they can be outside of some structures that they can't be outside in a sustainable way. And I think it is, as a citizen, I actually think it is hugely in the interests of the United States to support Europe in developing its structures, because whether it's Brexit or American policy, this should not be a gamble on India and Indonesia and Brazil failing. That the way to set good policy is at least to have a time horizon of a quarter of a century, even if you think you are only going to personally be affected by the effects over the next 5 to 10 or 15 years. And any policy judgments that are made on a time horizon of 1 to 2 years are rarely any good.
You've given us all a great deal to think about. We have about 15, 20 minutes for conversation, and I would like to open it up for comments. I have some of my own questions, but I'd like to open it up to the audience, and if you could just identify yourself and go ahead.
Just go ahead.
yeah.
Okay. Oh, yes, there are now the English ones. Sorry, I'm right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much to all the panelists. My question is to Mary. In 2004, I think it was, the NATO summit was held in Istanbul. And I remember very vividly, the theme of the summit was broader Middle East and North Africa and democratization, and all the panels were about that. And so I was very intrigued, when you said NATO, in a way, at some point assumed the task of the Marshall Plan. So I can't help but wonder, when did that happen, and why? Why did it happen? What's the rationale behind it? So that's my question.
Maybe we'll collect a couple of questions and then give people to respond. Yeah.
Yes.
Hello, Dimitri Sotiropoulos, visiting scholar, Center for European Studies. If I could have two members of the panel debate between themselves. Professor Lemke, I think not explicitly but implicitly advanced an idea of a more unified Europe in a quasi-federal model of the future. By contrast, Professor Tucker outlined a more differentiated model for the future. So my first of the two questions is, how does Professor Lemke react to the idea that we advance leaving some people behind? people, I mean some nations behind in different concentric circles. And the second question is to Professor Tucker. The Eurozone has 19 member states out of the 27 member states of the European Union. It seems to me that sooner or later, although I realize that this is not imminent, the remaining European Union member states would like to join the Eurozone. If that is a trend, how would you convince those who are not members of the Eurozone to stay outside?
I don't want to convince them. My prediction would be wrong.
So why don't we, I think that's a good basis for actually a conversation already. So why don't, Mary, would you like to go first, and then we can.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Obviously, you know, we're speaking very briefly here, so I'm simplifying. So it's a bit of a sweeping statement to say that the NATO assumed the task of the Marshall Plan. Obviously, NATO, and I think rightly, advertises itself as a community of values, not just a security alliance. So the protection of democracy has always been embedded in NATO. There's always been an overlap between the Marshall Plan and NATO from the start. The idea of NATO as a primarily political organization starts to emerge at the end of the Cold War, beginning of the post-Cold War period. Obviously, NATO in its initial form is to protect Western Europe from the Soviet Union. Check, right? Mission accomplished, right? And so, as I've written about, there's this discussion at the end of the Cold War, whether NATO, and you're sitting next to the author of another wonderful book, by the way, of NATO, Seth Johnston, who's also written about these topics. So, there's obvious discussion. Now, mission accomplished, does Europe hand America its hat, and does it go home, and does NATO disband or not? And if it's not going to disband, what is NATO's mission going to be? And so you then have, in the 90s, this development of new missions and new rationales and what seems to be a world in which peace, love, and understanding has broken out permanently on the European continent. And so then you have the goal of helping protect these new fledgling democracies that are just emerging, helping them to become secure and established. You also have new out-of-area missions, right? So you have this broadening of NATO's remit, and then it gets to the point where you have, as I pointed out, the irony that Madeleine Albright on the 50th anniversary of the Marshall Plan stands in the same place as George Marshall and basically says, we want to do X, Y, and Z, and it's the same goals, but now it's for NATO, not for... And the problem is that rhetoric is wonderful, but the organization fundamentally has not transformed, right? That it did not become a fundamentally political organization. It did not become a pan-European organization. As those of you who heard me speak before know, I've argued that there's only a new world order in rhetoric, right? A new world might have been emerging, but there wasn't a truly new world order. You have a lot of Cold War institutions perpetuated into the post-Cold War world, first among them NATO, and it fits very awkwardly with these new post-Cold War goals. And then, of course, you have a separate development, which is the de-democratization in Russia, right? The truly vicious domestic politics in Russia, the rise of Putin, and now the moment for creation of pan-Europeanism is well and truly gone. NATO did not become truly pan-European. Russia was left on the periphery of post-Cold War Europe by design. And now is not the time to try to change that, right? So NATO, I think, missed a number of opportunities, but how shall I put it? If your house is on fire, you don't remodel the kitchen, right? I mean, I think NATO has a number of flaws, but in the current circumstances, it would be a true tragedy if it fell apart under Trump's withering scorn.
Great, thank you. So, yes, Christina, do you want to respond to this point? I mean, in some ways, one can read the proposal of concentric, if Britain leaves the EU, the country that's holding back the process of European integration is finally gone, and now we can really get on with our business? Or is this actually, we're seeing evidence of a kind of what people have often called a multi-speed Europe, and this is just, sort of the scenario that Paul has just described. I'm curious on your reaction to this.
Yeah, I mean, you hear this argument sometimes that now we're glad the UK is leaving because now we can go on and, deepen the European Union. I think this is totally flawed and wrong, and personally I deeply regret not the referendum and the outcome, but the way the outcome was handled. Theresa May did not have to invoke Article 50 and say we are leaving the EU and now we already knew the result and then we negotiate. There were many other ways in which negotiations could have taken place, and now it's all kind of, it's this knot which is so difficult to untangle. The beauty of Paul's presentation of the concentric circles is that this is already reality in part in Europe. I mean, the European Union is a very kind of, it's a dynamic political institution as an EU. And we have 19 countries in the Eurozone, but the other countries are not a member. And not only countries that are economically maybe not quite ready, but countries like Sweden doing really well, also kind of squeezing out of this monetary union, which I find totally acceptable. And so the NATO membership is another difference. Not all EU members are members of NATO. Again, Sweden comes to mind, Austria, Ireland. So, we already have these differences. And my concern with the kind of, well, let's just have concentric circles and that's it, and not attempt to deepen Europe. Dimitri alluded to the fact that we will, if we say we have concentric circles, it seems to me like a fairly static kind of model where some countries are in the core and others are on the outside, and maybe they'll stay there forever. And some countries will always kind of set the stage for more integration. And I don't think that that is a good model, and particularly, how do you make decisions about the different policy areas? And as a political scientist, I'm really kind of concerned about the way we make political decisions based on legitimacy, based on transparency, accountability. And I think the European Union has not really done a very good job kind of building institutions that can really kind of help citizens to understand what's going on, but also to make future decisions. Just think about climate change. Where do you put that in the concentric circle? This is something we're all concerned with and something that affects us all. So are you going to put it in the core and then let Germany and France decide what everybody should do, and the other countries can just, not observe? But the Paris Agreement is an international treaty, and all countries actually have to should fulfill the criteria. So my concern is about decision making. The F word, the federal Europe. I understand that outside of Germany, a lot of people have trouble kind of thinking of Europe as a federal state. And maybe we don't really need kind of a strict federal model, but we clearly need an integrated Europe where decision-making is made by all members, but where there's also transparency across borders, so that we don't think in the category, this is good for France, so let's kind of push ahead, or this is good for Poland, let's just push ahead, but that where we have a discourse that, travels across borders and several countries, and ideally all countries would share in the discourse about what kind of Europe, but also what kind of policies do we want in the particular areas that concern us. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So Paul, how does decision-making work in this setup?
So there are some things, of course, climate change is one of them, which have to be decided at international level. So really the question is who would represent different circles in the international fora. The other thing I would say about that is that most, not all environmental policies are a component of regulatory policy. So that would be at the and in goods. So that would be a component of the regulatory union. Let me flip to being an economist for a moment, picking up both your question about the monetary union and Christiane's. So this is, I take no pleasure in this whatsoever. I'm not saying I think that normatively these countries should not join the monetary union ever. It's a prediction that I think that they are unlikely to meet their treaty obligations for reasons I'll explain in a moment, and that I think it is very serious to be running some kind of international institution where people have treaty obligations that they are very unlikely to meet. I don't think that's going to be an issue over the next 5 years, but I think if in some ways, sadly, I'm right in 25 years' time, I think it will be a big issue. So let me give you an example of why this is tough. So if you're in a monetary union, and it so happens that the biggest country in the monetary union has an extraordinary track record of generating quite rapid productivity growth year in, year out, which Germany does. And your country, because of the structure of the economy, small-scale businesses, tourism, cafes and things, does not find it so easy to generate productivity growth. Think about productivity growth. For those of you who aren't economists, think about how to generate productivity improvements in haircuts or something like that. If you're in an economy where the structure, it's harder to generate productivity improvements, then on average, over time, your unit wage costs must fall in real terms, to leave you in balance once you've exhausted your external borrowing capacity. And unless this is the middle of the 19th century, where you have a property-owning democracy and the misery of the people doesn't matter very much, you actually have to generate recessions to get unit labor costs to continue falling year in, year out, which, of course, people, I mean, I wouldn't like that very much. I doubt whether any of you would like it very much. And so I'm not talking about this happening over a 5-year period after a financial crisis, maybe 25 years, maybe 50 years or something like that. So this isn't going to be easy. This isn't going to be easy. It is not easy to generate productivity improvements. Another thing which flipping is Christiane said we already have this to some extent. Let me give you an example of where this wouldn't be so. And this is actually a point that we made in the paper I mentioned at the beginning. And I think the others won't be annoyed with me if I say at this stage. Do you remember when Merkel and Hollande and Rienzi met on a battleship for a summit off the coast of Italy? They had the last draft, the penultimate draft of the paper when they met there. And one element of the paper absolutely enraged people, because we said that a single market, which I'm calling a regulatory union, doesn't actually require complete freedom of movement in both factors of production, capital and labor, which are a matter of economics. It doesn't. To run a monetary union remotely efficiently, you need complete freedom of movement in both people and capital. So I'm not suggesting any of this would be easy. I'm suggesting at the moment that the construct demands things of people which teleologically may be great, but are liable to stretch the patience and willingness of the people, which I think is a Republican value. I mean, there is a risk that my tribe, the liberal technocratic elite, of which obviously I'm a member, I mean, not just a kind of sympathizing member, but someone who's sat at these tables, there is a risk that we drifted too far away from the tolerance of the people and their involvement and support for what was going on. That's true in my country as well, by the way.
Maybe we're nearly out of time. Maybe if we could get just one last round of questions, if there are questions. Yes.
Thank you very much. Seth Johnston, visiting scholar at the Center for European Studies. In response to having been called out and praised by Mary Serrati, allow me to ask a question going back to the origins of NATO, but one not just for Professor Serrati. I'm going to talk about Germany. I think Professor Lemke, you'll have something to say. And Paul Tucker, your idea of the outermost concentric circle of security may also be relevant here. So, Professor Serrati, you mentioned that the Marshall Plan and NATO were two sides of the same coin. I'm rather fond of Harry Truman's similar phrase that they were two halves of the same walnut. What would you say to the alternative explanations for the origins of NATO? You've characterized NATO as a Cold War institution that was formed to address the Soviet threat. The two other leading explanations are that NATO's origin was at least partially about keeping Germany down.
Right.
The North Atlantic Treaty of 1949 was the third treaty signed in as many years. The first two in 47 and 48, the Dunkirk and Brussels treaties, specifically mentioned Germany as the key threat that those alliances were against. And that NATO's continuation after the Cold War was substantially about making sure that a reunified Germany would be constrained and kept down in NATO. So that's competing argument number one, that NATO was at least partially about keeping Germany down. Alternative argument number two is what we might call the official version of what NATO says it's all about. And that most alliances are explicitly created against something, whether that's keeping Germany down or the Russians out, but that NATO was conceived not explicitly against anything, but rather for these enduring goals of peace and security. And to use the fire brigade analogy that you mentioned earlier, that we may have put out the fire of the Cold War, but the risk of fires coming up again is still there, and so why don't we maintain the fire brigade? Why don't we maintain NATO? We've seen NATO then being used to address other threats to peace and security, like the civil wars in the Balkans and the conflict in Afghanistan, NATO's longest and biggest conflict that's still ongoing today, 15 years after it took over there. So two competing explanations for the origins and purpose of NATO. How would you respond to those?
Let's just get one last question, perhaps. I'm friends with Tom, so I don't want to be biased to call him, but let's go for it, Tom. You're
I'm happy for someone else to. Okay, right. I mean, I hear the criticism here of this Europe of concentric circles. The idea that then people will feel left behind, and it's the Germans and the French who take the decisions at the center. But isn't ultimately the criticism and the idea that therefore this Europe of concentric circles wouldn't work ultimately very much a German or a Brussels view, which is ultimately based on the idea that ultimately all Europeans would want to prefer this republican, this federal Europe, but wouldn't be the point that the majority of people in some of these countries would genuinely prefer to only be in one of those circles. Of course, you will always have a minority of people who will be bitter. If I'm in offshore Europe in Scotland, I will be very bitter to be out of some of those circles. But the point would be that the majority of the people would be perfectly happy to be in that different kind of Europe, and wouldn't therefore, Paul Tucker's case, that there would be more legitimacy for European integration and better functioning of Europe ultimately stand.
And the way we know majorities is through referendum, which we know works so beautifully, right? So let's each give
Our just one final round.
We got the high sign earlier that there's drinks being prepared for all of us. And so we, let's see, scholarly exchange, drinks. Okay, let's go. So that's a way of saying I could talk about your question, till everyone here loses the will to live. It's a great question. And also thank you, because it would be wrong to let the 70th anniversary of NATO go by without quoting Lord Ismay, because that line is required at every meeting where NATO is discussed, that NATO is to keep the Soviets out, to keep the Americans in, and to keep the Germans down. So yes, obviously, I'm fond of saying, as a historian, the one phenomenon I have never observed is an event that happened for one reason. I've never seen monocausality. All right, important events happen for a multiplicity of reasons, and obviously all of those are factors in them. The idea of keeping, the Soviets out, the U.S. and the Germans down, and also the idea that you have an alliance of values. Those are all in the service of creating a strong alliance that ultimately can be successful in its goals. So I don't know that these are necessarily mutually incompatible, but you're right. There's a lot of irons in the fire. I just wanted actually to step back, and perhaps this is a bridge then to the comments you're going to make, and say something about security generally, the security ring. in New Orleans, there weren't a lot of people who were experts on the state of the levees, but after Hurricane Katrina, it was all anyone could think about. I think security arrangements are like that. I think security arrangements get taken for granted or get covered up by other concerns on a day-to-day basis, but once they fail, it's all you can think about. And so I think you're absolutely right to put the security ring on the outside and say that almost no matter what else Britain wants to do, it's going to be in the security ring. These issues, when push comes to shove, NATO is a security organization, and that is that's going to be a difficult challenge to reconcile with the whatever future tense relations there are there between Britain and the European Union.
Yeah, and I mean the term security, I would define it a little broader than just saying, we are a military alliance, we can beat the Russians. That would be a very kind of crude definition of NATO, and I think the interesting development, and Seth has actually written about it, NATO has adapted, has changed over time. And two areas I would like to point out. One is fighting terrorism. I mean, that seems to be a challenge that will be with us for some time to come. And it requires larger organizations than just, a country's army. So that's, one major challenge. And the other, cybersecurity, and that is another area of security that NATO has actually picked up and done more. So from the German perspective, NATO was very controversial when we first joined West Germany in 1955. There were a lot of protest movements against joining NATO, actually, and some of the activists reemerged in 1990 when Germany unified, saying, now the Cold War is over, let's, get rid of NATO and have some other security alliance. However, nowadays in Germany, it's a broad consensus that NATO is a good thing. Just yesterday, there was a survey coming out. 85% of the Germans feel that NATO is very important. And because of new challenges and tasks that we are facing. So the support for NATO in united Germany nowadays is very strong, but we also see it as kind of complementary to what we are trying to kind of develop a European common defense and security policy. But that only goes together with NATO. Nobody thinks that a European common defense and security policy, European army, and so on will be something that will make NATO obsolete. The other point I wanted to make in response to your comment, I mean, I'm sure there are people who would like to join in some of the common policies and not in others. Now, when you look at the UK discourse, one of the the most controversial field of the four freedoms is freedom of movement of people, migration. That was one of the key arguments during the Brexit referendum. We want to control our borders, right? But when you look more closely, the resentment was against the Polish plumber, an EU citizen who has the right of freedom of movement. And it's not about the refugees. It's not about the Africans coming to Europe's shore. It's more about we don't want, the open, the free movement of people within Europe. And I don't think that you should have a right to choose about it. If you are a member of the European Union over a long period of time, then I think the freedom of movement of people is one of the most beautiful things that we have accomplished. And ask young people. I mean, this is really something the EU stands for, people support. And for the future, I think this is very important. So if I say I opt out of it, I don't want the free movement of people. I want the free movement of capital and goods and maybe, services. That's okay. But the other is not okay. I don't think that you really do justice to the idea of European integration. I can see why you opt out of NATO or you say, I don't want the common currency for a variety of reasons. But that is something I would, see no compromises.
So the last word goes to you, Paul.
Thank you. So on NATO, which we've talked before, you know much more about this than I do. I mean, mostly great institutions are overdetermined. I mean, they're different actors are motivated to some extent by ideas, some by interests, some by power. if I think of an institution I know hugely better than NATO, although, as we've discussed, I know NATO for personal reasons a little bit. Federal Reserve. There's a huge debate about why it was founded in 1913. And there isn't a monolithic answer to it, because different actors in the foundation of the Federal Reserve are motivated by different things. So if I was trying to persuade Christian of this, which I want to, and I really want you to take this seriously when I say, imagine the UK didn't exist, I would still be recommending this. I would say, I think, three things if I was meeting you across the negotiating table. I'd say, first of all, if you're right, nobody will opt to be in the outer rings. They will all opt to be in the inner rings at the outset. I think the second thing I would say is that being one of the outer rings doesn't preclude moving to the inner rings at all. But actually being in the innermost ring, the monetary fiscal union, it is actually quite hard to move out of. I was called by people in your capital and others when the question of Greece leaving, and the answer they had said, is it possible? Basically the question was, is it possible to do this? And my answer was, I think these are almost word for word, was no one you speak to will say anything intelligent about this. The very best of my tribe doesn't know how to do that. It might be possible one day, I don't know, but it's going to be, given your beliefs, you realizing your vision is going to be most awkward if people feel trapped in a monetary union that is inflicting hardship on their people. The third thing I would say about freedom of movement is, and again, please, I'm actually going to allow one part of London the UK to exist for this, which is London. But if you're trying to run Hungary and Poland and Romania, or the other countries, Bulgaria to some extent as well, you have suffered an absolutely massive brain drain of young, ambitious, highly educated people. And above all else, they have come to the city I live in. And this has probably made the politics of those countries more difficult rather than easier, because the kind of liberal Republican to which you are dedicated is underrepresented in parts of Hungary and parts of Poland, precisely because the youngest and the ambitious have left, because the state of development of those economies is so much. Well, everyone is behind London currently in the state of economic development. Now, my point is, it's not that these are.
Have you been to Warsaw? I mean,
Poland
is a booming country.
Yeah, but it's nowhere near as rich as London, and the opportunities aren't nearly as great. And I do know Warsaw, and I know Berlin as well. And my point is that not that the points I'm making are knockout blows. It's that actually this is quite complicated, and you can think of circumstances where freedom of movement may not have served the values of the rule of law in Central and Eastern Europe. And I can't demonstrate that, but there are certainly respectable people that have that concern. And so, we're just sitting on a panel, but actually just doing these things for real it's a kind of heavy burden for those of the people that are unlucky enough to have office.
All right, so before we thank our panelists, I just want to, well, let's first thank our panelists, and then, but before you get out of your seats, I just want to say again that we now have this opening at the Jacek Gidrich Gallery next door, and so I invite everybody to attend this. We're going to have a reception afterwards. Just a couple of words of thanks, though, before I let you go, just to our curator, Jan Kubashevich, who will be talking about the exhibit. Also to Grzegorz Ekiert and Bettina Birch. Grzegorz is not here, but have played a really critical role. And a special thanks to the HKS alum Andres Deriva, who's back here, who in the Harvey Family Collection, without whom this would have all been impossible. So we'll hear more from them upstairs, but just wanted to thank you first. And thank you, everyone, once again, and see you all upstairs very quickly. Thank you.